I need a pen. I probably have one. Tom, when you come back, grab me a pen. Thank you. Oh, look, they're not out.
Don't go find one.
There they are. They're on the tree. Okay, when he comes back, I'll point him in the right direction. Right? I'm telling you what, Jordan. Me and Lane are gonna go grocery shopping today. And I'm gonna be very smart, like I'm gonna buy my stock, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
My John stock. And I'm gonna buy white sugar. Which I really don't need much. Mostly I use brown sugar, don't you?
No, I use the white sugar. And I don't use it a lot. I'm not a baker.
Anyway, so we're gonna try to I'm gonna try to make a list.
I hope I've been used it a couple different times.
Wouldn't it be great?
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the case. I think it's a one-timer. And so if it is, I'll just, because I like this chicken stock that's in the beef stock.
Okay.
It's in the jar.
Yeah.
That lasts you forever.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I like it for gravy and stuff like that when there's not enough flavor.
Uh-huh.
You know,
I buy
juice.
bouillon cubes to put in my.
I do too. But
Just making it.
no, see, I already took care of it.
Angie's there.
I already took care of it.
Angie's okay.
You don't have to, you know, it's not.
He likes it.
I'll show it to you. I'll take a picture.
Can you buy like paper products with that?
I'm hungry.
No, Andy's gonna pen it for you.
It is so nice, Fred.
He's out there.
He gave me the songs because they didn't have it in time.
Oh.
Obviously.
Friday and Saturday.
Phil was sending it today, so he didn't have the numbers till this morning.
And all we have left.
That's so nice. You need it too? I'll get a copy of it.
He must have forgotten.
Well, I think it's about time to get started here, and Ron, would you mind leading us in an opening prayer?
Father in heaven, we're thankful for the many blessings you shower on us daily. We hope and pray that we do not take them lightly. We would ask you to be with the teachers this morning as they bring to us the things that they have studied, that we may take them in our everyday life and use them to thy glory. Be with the sick, afflicted that can't be here this morning for whatever reason. Help them, guide them. May they be brought back to their health. We ask in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ron. We're in Genesis, and we're in the last paragraph of chapter 24, and we'll begin 25 also today. So Genesis 24, chapter 24. I'm going to read this last paragraph, verse 66, starting there through, I think, 67, to introduce our discussion so far. As you know, this whole story in chapter 24 is a very long story. It's the longest chapter in Genesis. And it's the story, the whole main thing of the story, the theme of the story is what?
To get a wife.
For
Isaac.
yes, and her name was Rebecca, right? So it's a long journey. They have to travel up north to almost to the land of Turkey, modern day Turkey, where they actually lived. So it was from his family. Abraham did not want a wife from what group of people that he was trying to avoid a wife for his son? What group did he not want him to pick a wife from? Yeah, the Canaanites, and that's because they were idolaters, worshipers at that time. So he sends his servant to retrieve a bride, and he's successful. And he tells the story to Isaac when he gets back, and that begins in verse 66. Then the servant told Isaac all that he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So the servant begins to tell the story of exactly how things went. That was Eliezer. So the story of how all the events transpired when he retrieved Rebekah from his relatives and how she agreed to come and marry him. Notice it says, where does Isaac bring her right away?
Mother's tent.
Yeah, into his mother's tent. And that's kind of interesting, I think, because Sarah has already passed away. She has been gone for about 2 to 3 years at this point, but apparently her tent is still there. And he actually marries her. It seems like he's saying he married her right in that tent that his mother used to live in. Notice too, what kind of a marriage would we call this today?
Arranged.
Yeah, it's an arranged marriage. Neither one saw each other before the marriage ceremony, and this was very common back in that time. It's still common in many parts of the world today. This still goes on. And Isaac, is he pleased with his bride? Yeah, it seems like he's very pleased. He seems like he quickly falls in love with her. So it's that type of marriage still does work in many respects. If it's done for the right reasons, it's not always a bad way to set up a marriage, but it has to be done the right way, because you can do it the wrong way too. So, but then again, how bad a choices do sometimes people make when they are given the choice today? Sometimes they can mess it up just as bad as anybody else doing the arranged marriage. And what's interesting about this is, I want to focus on this a little bit. Notice it said, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. It's been 2 to 3 years. And obviously, just before this, before he just meets her, it says he was out in the countryside meditating when he finally gets his first look at her. And it appears that Isaac is suffering a little bit, doesn't it?
I was gonna say, the wife's gonna fill the void of the loss of a mother.
Yeah. And I know in this congregation and in my own family, I'm sure many of you probably have experienced this too. We all grieve differently. Some of us grieve very strongly, depending on who it is. But sometimes it takes years and years before some people can function after the death of a loved one. I know a lot of people that for years are still struggling, even in this congregation and in my own family, after the death of loved ones. And it can be very difficult for people to get by. I mean, sometimes that's in their thoughts all day long, and it's hard for them to get past it. So we need to have sympathy for that. Sandy Wittenberg actually organized a group here at Flanders for widows to get together and talk and meet together and maybe grieve together a little bit too. And I think that's a wonderful little ministry that Sandy has formed for the widows. And I think it's a good thing to have something like that here at the church. Anybody have any thoughts or on this issue? All right, let's move on. Chapter 25, verse 1. Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore him, and there's several names here, there's six sons through verse 4. And verse 5 picks up, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines, and then sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. So notice in verse 1 it says, Abraham took another wife. Does it say whether Sarah was still alive when Sarah took this other wife? It doesn't seem to say anything one way or the other about that. I would suspect it was after, but I don't know that. It doesn't say that specifically. But notice she is called a wife and not a concubine in this passage. But if you look over in 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 32, she's referred to a little bit differently there, but she is mentioned in one of the genealogy sections. The descendants of Keturah, verse 32, the sons born to Keturah, Abraham's concubine. So she's referred to here as his concubine. In Genesis, she's referred to as his wife. Also, too, when Abraham was in the situation with Sarah where she was unable to have children, she suggested that he take her handmaid, and have children through her. And in that particular passage, she is referred to, that's Hagar, as a wife. So he had two wives at the same time, but in other places, Hagar is also referred to as a concubine. So I've always been curious about what's the difference between a concubine and a wife. Has anybody ever done any reading? I have a view on it from some of the things I've read.
Other than the concubine was considered like a secondary wife,
Okay.
at least in some places.
Yeah, well, when you say secondary, I agree with that. What exactly is the result of being secondary? What does that limit her in?
Maybe his possessions after death.
Yeah, it seems like it's an inheritance thing a little bit, isn't it? Notice it says that Abraham had concubines. How many does that mean? How many concubines did he have?
More than one.
It's plural. It's more than one. Back in Genesis chapter 14, verse 14, when Abraham went to war to rescue Lot, who had been captured, he had 318 men with him who were born in his household. And one of the commentators said these were probably the sons of his concubines. And I thought, that's reaching a little bit. 318, and it doesn't say they were sons, it says men. So I kind of take exception with that. I think that commentator is reaching a little bit. The only thing it mentions, as far as names are concerned, is Hagar and Keturah. Those are the only two that are named. They're both called wives and they're both called concubines.
I always thought that a wife, like, shared your tent, where concubines had their own tent. Like, you would go to them, where a wife shared your tent.
I think there might be some truth to that, although it does seem like Sarah had her own tent too.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, whether Abraham was in that tent too, I don't know. But it appears that Isaac and Rebecca took over this tent. It kind of implies that a little bit too. So I know people sometimes have husbands and wives that sleep in separate bedrooms because one of them makes a lot of noise at night. I've heard that story. I won't say who, but nonetheless, that happens from time to time in marriages. So we don't know for sure how many concubines Abraham had. I think the context seems to indicate that there's just two concubine wives and one dominant wife, and the dominant wife was clearly Sarah. So as far as the inheritances are concerned, what have we learned from the scriptures as far as what did Abraham do concerning his inheritances? Let's start with Hagar. What happened with the story with Hagar? She was sent away, right? And God told Abraham to go ahead and do it. Abraham was distressed because he cared about him. He clearly cared about his son and even the handmaid. but he had to let him go. But God promised what concerning Hagar and Ishmael? Yeah, he said he was going to take care of them. And did he? Yes, he did. We'll find out later in the chapter that indeed God did take care of them very well and promised him a good life. When it comes to Keturah here, what's the situation with her and the children that she bore, the sons that she bore? What does Abraham do in this situation?
Sent away the children while he was alive. So obviously that means they were old enough. They were
Yes.
kids.
Yes. And does he give them anything?
Gives them gifts.
He gives them gifts. It doesn't say what it is, but obviously he gave them a partial type of inheritance for them to live on. And let's face it, even our society today, sons leave their parents' household and they go off on their own, and sometimes the parents help them as they leave. I remember my dad gave me, I think it was in my early 20s, I was still living with him, and he said, "Jeff, it's time for you to be out on your own. You got 6 months. Find a place to live." Hey, Dad. And I did. It was fine. I didn't mind it. So
It was common. It wasn't that uncommon.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's normal. All sons leave. So Abraham sent them out. But there's also another reason why Abraham wanted to send them out, because there's 6 of them, and not counting Ishmael. Why would Abraham want these guys, these sons, to leave? He probably cared for all of them too, but he wanted them to leave. Why?
So there's no conflict with Isaac?
What's
So
that?
there's no conflict with Isaac?
Yeah. And even today, we see some of the ugliness in human beings really comes out after funerals when you're dealing with inheritances. People get really, really ugly, and I just get disgusted when I see it. And I've seen people get cheated out of their inheritances, and I know what it's like, and it's sad when you see it. And there's not much you can do about it, because sometimes people's baser instincts kicked in. And in this time and age too, there was no police. There was hardly any laws you can think of to restrict people's behavior. And if 5 brothers decide to kill one of the brothers, nobody's going to put them in jail. And if Abraham's other sons decide that they don't like the fact that Isaac got too much from the inheritance, they could have done something about it through force. And that was common back in those days for stuff like kings had to deal with that all the time. Sometimes a king would put one in charge, another son would rise up and massacre the entire family, kill everybody in his own family, just so he could get the power. So Abraham was not ignorant of these facts. He knew human nature. He knew that this was a possibility. So he took charge of the situation, prepared things in advance, gave his sons gifts, sent them off probably with his love, and they were probably happy to go and be fine. But God, and typically throughout scriptures in the Old Testament too, who usually got the biggest share of an inheritance in almost every case? Yeah, it's the firstborn son usually. And that was common back then. But that is not the only reason why Isaac was getting the bigger share. What is the real reason in God's mind?
He received the promise.
Yeah, he received the promise. Explain what that means.
It was through him that God promised that the seed of Abraham would outnumber the stars.
Yeah.
So he would be the father of the entire world, and it would come through Isaac.
All right. So, but that was promised before he was born too, wasn't it? How does God know that? How does God know Isaac's going to be?
Because he's God.
How does he know Isaac's going to be faithful? How does he know Isaac's children are going to be faithful in the distant future?
He read the Bible.
He read the Bible. That's actually a pretty good answer, really. He read the Bible in a sense because he knew the future. And you can see it time and time again. We're going to see it in this chapter. God knows exactly what's going to happen. He tells them all ahead of time. what's gonna happen in the future. And God makes all of his plans with the future in mind, because he knows people, and he knows how they are, and he knows how they're gonna turn out. And obviously, he knew Isaac was gonna remain faithful to the Lord. So, and that's a good thing. So God makes the promises through him, and that's why he got the lion's share. And technically, Abraham in this time and age was extremely wealthy. In today's standard, he would clearly probably be a billionaire. I mean, that's how much livestock, cattle, money he had. He was extremely wealthy. He had massive numbers of people working for him. So much so that people feared him like you would fear another country, because he could inflict a lot of damage on people if he chose to. But he didn't, but he could have. And he did go to war one time too, and he was very successful when he did go to war one time. So he sends them all away, and let's begin in verse 7 now. Altogether, Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. So Abraham was about 140 when Sarah died. So he had about 37 years in between where he could have been married to Keturah at that time, unless he took her before that, which it doesn't say one way or the other. And that could account for him having 6 children, 6 boys at least. And there may have been other children too, but it doesn't always mention them too. So, and what's interesting, you can notice from this point on, the age of human beings begins to decline. It's already declined a great deal from the Garden of Eden, but as time's going on, it keeps reducing and getting smaller and smaller, where people don't live nearly as long as they did in the very beginning. Abraham's 175, which in our standards today is outrageously long. Today it's rare to see anybody that makes it even to 120. I've heard some that made it into the teens of the 100, but not very often and not very many. So our bodies just aren't built that way anymore. All right. So he was full of years and he was gathered to his people. What does that mean, gathered to his people? What can you imply by reading that statement? Gathered to his people.
I think his people came to him.
Okay, what do you mean?
They gathered to him.
How'd that happen when he died? His people were gathered to him.
Funeral.
Okay, I suppose you could look at it that way too. I think there's another aspect of it too also.
They wanted their share.
Well, yeah, if you're talking about the funeral, but it notice it says he was gathered to his people.
Does it mean?
Is it just referring to the funeral, or could there be another part of it?
Could it be, when we read in Kings that he slept with his fathers or buried with his fathers?
Yes. There's a lot of references in the Old Testament for several of the prominent characters with statements like that, statements like this. It's referring to the afterlife. It's referring to what happens after death. So if everybody was dead in the grave and they were nothing, would he be being gathered to his people? Would that be a correct way to say it? No. So obviously it implies that there's an afterlife. They believed in the afterlife. Clearly there's a number of scriptures that talk about that they believed that there's an afterlife. Some people try to infer in the Old Testament they didn't believe in the afterlife, and that is just not true. There's too many references to stuff like this. So whatever it means, it clearly means that the people of God, the people who follow God, have a gathering in the afterlife. And what would we call that today? Heaven. Yeah, it's heaven. So that's where our gathering will be, is in heaven itself. And even in Hebrews, it talks about the fact that Abraham looked for another country. a heavenly one. And he mentions that in chapter 11 of Hebrews, where Abraham looked forward to that heavenly gathering in heaven someday, not on this earth, where the redeemed of God's people would gather together in the final gathering where we live forever. Philip?
Yeah, if you notice here, that it talks about Abraham dying and being gathered to his people. You compare this with Jesus talking about the deaths of the dead man, the rich man and Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
And Lazarus is gathered to bosom of Father Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than gathered to his people, it seems as if later on it morphed into this other setting. Instead of saying gathered to his people, you're gathered to the bosom of Father Abraham.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something we can also look at.
Yeah, and you can see Abraham's on the other end now. He's the one that's already there.
Right.
People are coming to him now, just like he is going to his fathers and those who have died previously before in his life. So that's kind of interesting when you really think about it.
Jeff,
Yes.
in Daniel 12:2, there's also a reference of the resurrection of the dead.
There's actually two references in Daniel 12. Go ahead, read it.
Well, I don't have it here, but I just read it, and so I was like, I know, like I just went through Daniel, and I know that there was a reference, and here's Daniel 12:2, many who sleep in the dust of the land will awake, some to permanent life and some to disgrace and permanent contempt. And then Daniel 12:3, those who have insight will shine like the bright expanse of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever.
Clearly an Old Testament reference that talks very bluntly, very specifically about the afterlife for the evil and for the good. So they're both mentioned.
It's interesting that it mentions that he was gathered to his people, then it says his sons buried him.
Yes.
Like he was already with them before.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So
All
it's,
right. Yeah.
just
Hey, yeah, let's
think about him.
Yeah, no, you're right. Let's go to that verse where it says that in verse 9. It says, his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. The field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahani Roni, and that's a very southern part of the nation that we would call Israel today. It's very far south in the nation. So what's interesting too is Ishmael comes back to his father's funeral, which is kind of interesting. I think that, and we know that Ishmael did not live very far away from Abraham, even though he was sent out and away. He was still fairly close where he lived, because he was in the extreme south too, just a little further south. He was more in the wilderness areas than Abraham was, but and he was. It probably was not hard for Isaac to locate Ishmael and say, "Hey, Dad's died. We're gonna have a funeral," and he shows up. So I think that's interesting that he shows up, and they bury their father together, and they bury him where?
In that cave that he bought
Yeah.
for Sarah.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I think I might have mentioned this a few weeks ago. I tried to do a little bit of research on the internet, and those caves are still there to this day. The only thing is, it's hard to see them because they got this huge building over the top where the caves were at, and the Muslims won't let anybody in there. Which there's a lot of sites that are forbidden for anybody, Jews or Christians, to see, even though they have a long-standing interest in the things too. But there have been a few people that have gone in there in the last couple hundred years, and they reported what they saw. And there indeed is caves down there that are sealed, that are graves, and they saw the actual grave sites that are there. But I don't think anybody needs to see that anyhow. But it's interesting that they are still there to this very day, so they know where they're at. So now, like somebody like David, they don't know where he's at. They never could find the grave of King David, which I think is kind of interesting. So nonetheless, they bury him with his wife, and at that time. How many sons altogether did Abraham have?
At least 8.
Yeah, he had at least 8. That is recorded here. And we know Isaac was the most blessed one of them all because for spiritual reasons. So you can keep that in mind as far as that. Now, notice in the next section we're going to read here, it explains a little bit more about Ishmael. It gives us an update of what has happened to Ishmael after the funeral. Verse 12, this is the account of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's maidservant Hagar the Egyptian bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael listed in the order of their birth. And I'm not going to say their names. Go to verse 16. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers, according to their settlements and camps. Altogether, Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Hilvah to Shur, near the border of Egypt, as you go towards Asher, and they lived in hostility towards all their brothers. So Ishmael had how many children? At least 12 sons. We don't know how many daughters he had, but he had at least 12 sons. And notice he says they become tribal leaders. In other words, it sounds like they separated each of the sons and formed their own groups all around in that particular area, and they got along wonderfully. What does it say about them?
They fell.
Huh?
They fell amongst each other.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of disagreement among the brothers for some reason. I don't know what it is, but they definitely had some hostility towards their brothers. And would that include Isaac and the Israelites too? Oh yeah, they're brothers too, from the same father. So that included the Israelites. Today, who are the sons of Ishmael? Can we identify who they are to this very day? Tried to check out this a little bit. The closest I could come is today we would call them nomads or Arabs. Most of them are still in the southern regions in those areas, but they are spread out a little bit in different areas, and there's been a lot of intermarriage since then too. But generally they are nomads. They still have times where they travel around in caravans and move around that particular area. And there's still a lot of hostility over in that part of the world among those people. And it's not just because of outsiders, they fight among themselves more than anything else. So it seems like there seems to be a long-standing difficulty for people in that area to get along with one another. And I noticed we've had a number of American presidents who've tried to make peace treaties over there to get everybody to get along. And it seems like none of the peace treaties last for very long because of this. And I think some of it has to do with this long-standing history of they're just a disagreeable bunch. They just seem to fight a lot, and why that is, I don't know. I can't tell you. So, nonetheless, that's about all we can say for that issue there. Any questions or comments at this point here? All right, let's go on. Verse 19. This is the account of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel of Armenia from Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. Now what's interesting about this is here we have another case where the chosen family is having difficulties with what issue? Fertility issues. Now, in the particular case with Abraham and Sarah, who was the infertile one between Abraham and Sarah?
Sarah.
How do you know that?
Because Abraham had real trouble having Ishmael and all of these other
Yeah. So it seems like Sarah was the one that had the infertility issue. Whether that's true with Rebecca or not, or it's Isaac, we don't know. Doesn't matter. But nonetheless, they were married for how long before he begins to pray?
20 years.
Maybe that didn't show up till later. Yeah. Either way, it takes 20 years. They're married 20 years and no kids. So Isaac becomes very concerned. Rebecca is very concerned. And he says a prayer for Rebecca. And God does answer the prayer. A lot quicker than he answers the prayer of Sarah. Why? I don't know. So he does answer the prayer, and she does become pregnant. All right, so, excuse me. Verse 22. The babies jostle with each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" It must have been really violent for some reason in her womb to feel that strongly about it. Why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, now God's talking to Rebecca. The Lord says to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. And could you imagine her reaction when God said that to her? 2 nations are in your womb, and she's probably thinking, what? So what does this tell you about God in his discussion with Rebecca? It tells you a little something else about the fact, okay, you're pregnant, and God's explained to her the situation, and why is this situation working out this way? Why is this happening? This jostling in her womb.
They're already fighting.
They're already fighting. And why does God say that? What does he say about the fighting?
One's gonna be stronger than the other.
Yeah, there's a result down the road, isn't there? So God, once again,
And the older is gonna be
yeah,
blood by the younger.
yes,
Which is the same thing that happened with Isaac. He was the second.
yeah. So God, once again, is looking into the future, and he's telling them what's going to happen in the future. And it does happen exactly like he said. And it just goes to shows you the omniscience of God and his ability to see into the future. Verse 24, when the time came for her to give birth, part of this I think is kind of humorous in a way. There were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment.
Just like, yeah.
Can you imagine? Well, I mean, most women, if they had a baby that came out that looked red and looked like a hairy garment, they'd be thinking, what in the world is this? I mean, I can't picture, I can just picture her eyes, just like, and everybody looking at this thinking, oh, we gotta shave him already, and he's just coming out. So, whatever the situation was, some kids when they're born, they got a lot of hair, and some have none, and obviously Esau had quite an abundance of hair, and he was red. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. So there's the 20 years that I was talking about. So, and that's partly what Jacob's name means, is grasping at the heel. That's partly what his name has a meaning for. So, and why was he grasping at his heel? There's some symbolism here. What is the reason for the grasping of the heel? As the history goes on.
Well, he wanted to be first, wanted the birthright.
Yeah.
So,
I think he was trying to pull him back in, saying, I want to be first. So, but Esau said, nope, I'm going first, sorry. So either way, it works out that way. Verse 27, the boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. Isaac had a taste for wild game and loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Uh-oh. We got a family problem here? Yeah, this doesn't usually work out real well in families. They both had their reasons for liking one over the other, and this plays out in a very long drama that takes years and years for this whole story to play out. And it appears that Isaac likes wild game, and Esau was a hunter and would bring in wild game for him to eat. And Rebekah probably stayed in the tents, and Jacob was probably around a lot. So she saw her son a lot, had a relationship with him, while Esau was out in the countryside, hunting and fishing or doing whatever he did as far as his wilderness skills concerned. And then the story comes out here in verse 29. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom, which means red. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. What is Jacob trying to do again?
Be number one.
Be number one again. He knew what the birthright meant. Isaac did get the birthright, didn't he? He was the firstborn son, the favored son, the one that got the greater inheritance and the blessings from God. And this is a historical thing that goes throughout all of Israelite history. Among firstborn sons, they got the blessing, they got the greater inheritance, and many other perks that went along with being the firstborn. Jacob wanted this. He did not want to be second. I don't know if Rebekah had anything to do with this first part, but I suspect she did. I think she might have whispered in his ear some of these things, perhaps, because it turns out later on she was involved in some of these issues. So Esau comes in, he's starving, and what does he ask for? Some stew. And Jacob says, what?
It'll cost you.
It's gonna cost you. And Esau said, no way. I can't give all that up for just a bowl of stew.
He didn't care.
No, he didn't care.
He didn't care.
He figured he was gonna die if he didn't get something to eat.
And in modern day terminology, you probably call this person a dummy.
So do I sign.
It's a really dumb move, very dumb move on Esau's part to do this. Perhaps he was thinking, you know, I'm just going to say this for now and he can't really take it away from me. But in the long scheme of things, who was the chosen one of God between Jacob and Esau? It was Jacob. Did God hear what Esau said about his birthright?
Yes.
Yeah.
You bet he did. And well, you think God was pleased with that situation? I don't think so. I think God was saying, fine, you don't want it, I'll give it to Jacob. Because I know he's going to appreciate it in the long run anyhow, and he's going to be in my favored one anyhow. So Esau got exactly what he deserved, even though I don't think he really realized what he was doing. I don't think he saw the repercussions, how this was all going to play out in the end, and he became very upset later on. But we'll get to that later on. We're out of time now. Any questions or thoughts on this section here? We'll stop here in this verse.
How are you? No problem. She was out.
No, actually,
She was there. I did.
I sent an email a little bit the other night. said mine, I just went
Probably
to
didn't show up though. I know they were done. She was a little upset you didn't carry her in your fish.
one no.
I don't think that
I wasn't.
No, I know, you know what I'm saying? We don't know.
Yeah.
Hey, cheaper than a trip.